My name is Nora, I'm 27 years old, and 6 weeks ago, my own family assembled 45 relatives inside a private banquet hall. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, aunts who only called at funerals, my grandmother's old church friends who had no idea what they'd walked into. All of it staged and choreographed to break me. They thought I'd fold. They thought I'd cry, apologize, and sign. They didn't know my grandmother had been one step ahead of them for the last 2 years of her life. But let me start at the beginning. Because to understand what happened that night, you need to understand who she was. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She was 74 when she died last spring, and she was the only person in my family who ever looked at me like I was worth something. Not worth something if I became a doctor like my sister. Not worth something if I stopped chasing a career in art. Just worth something. Period. Full stop. I'm a graphic designer. I work from home, I take on freelance clients, and I've spent the last 4 years slowly building something that actually pays the bills and makes me feel alive at the same time. My parents have never forgiven me for it. They wanted the version of me that wore business casual and attended networking brunches. Instead, they got the version who keeps weird hours, drinks too much coffee, and genuinely loves her work. A disappointment, in their view. A cautionary tale they told at dinner parties. But Grandma Ruth, she used to call me every Sunday just to ask what I was working on. She'd listen for 20 minutes while I rambled about color palettes and client feedback and ideas I hadn't fully figured out yet. She never once said that sounds like a hobby, or when are you going to get a real job? She just listened, and at the end she'd say, "Keep going, sweetheart, the world needs people who make beautiful things." She left me her house when she died, a small craftsman cottage about an hour outside of the city, painted pale yellow, with a converted studio in the backyard where she used to paint watercolors every afternoon. She'd been painting since before my mother was born. Landscapes, mostly. The creek behind the house, the old maple tree in the front yard, the neighbor's dog who used to sit by the fence and stare at her like she was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. I was her only grandchild who ever sat with her in that studio. My sister thought painting was quaint. My cousins thought it was boring. I thought it was magic. She taught me to hold a brush properly when I was 9 years old, standing behind me with her hands over mine, guiding me through the first stroke. "You don't force it," she told me. "You suggest it, and then you let the painting tell you what it wants to be." I've been a designer ever since. The tools are different. The principle is the same. 6 weeks ago, I was in the middle of a deadline when my mother called. My mother does not call. She sends short texts that read like memos. "Call me back. Important." Or "Where are you? We need to talk." The fact that her name was lighting up my phone with an actual incoming call was enough to make my stomach tighten before I even answered. Nora. Her voice was warm in a way it almost never is. Carefully warm, practiced warm. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "I'm working," I said. "What's going on?" She took a breath. The kind of breath people take when they're about to say something they've rehearsed. "Your father and I have been thinking, with everything that happened this year, losing Mom, the estate, we feel like the family has drifted. We'd like to do a gathering. A proper sit-down dinner, everyone together." She paused. "For you, actually. Sort of a belated celebration. You had a big year." I nearly laughed. My mother had not celebrated a single thing I'd done in at least a decade. Not my first major client. Not my first feature in a design publication. Not my move into my own apartment. The fact that she was now volunteering to host something for me landed exactly the way a warning flare lands, bright, impossible to ignore, and signaling something very bad on the horizon. "Who's everyone?" I asked. "Family," she said, which told me nothing. "Saturday, 6 o'clock, the Harrington Room at the Grand Valley Hotel. Don't be late." She hung up before I could ask another question. I sat in my home office for a long time after that, staring at the wall. Something felt wrong. Not in a dramatic way. In a quiet, creeping way, like the feeling you get when you walk into a room and can tell someone was just there but isn't anymore. 3 days later, my sister showed up at my apartment unannounced. Her name is Danielle. She's 32, a hospital administrator, and she has spent the better part of our adult lives being gently condescending toward me, in ways she can always claim were just concern. She knocked on my door at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, which she had never done before. Dressed like she was coming from work, carrying 2 coffees she'd bought from the place on my corner. Which meant she'd planned this. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, handing me one. She was not in the neighborhood. I lived 25 minutes from her office. I let her in. She looked around my apartment the way people look at a place they've already decided to have an opinion about, taking in the design sketches pinned to my wall, the second monitor, the stack of art books by the window, and smiled a small, tight smile. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Really, I'm fine. What's happening, Danielle?" She sat down on my couch and wrapped both hands around her coffee. "I've been thinking about Grandma's cottage." There it was. "It's mine," I said. "It was left to me. The will was clear." "I know." She nodded, careful, measured. "I'm not disputing that. I'm just saying, it's a significant property, Nora. It's been appraised at nearly $400,000, and it's sitting empty. I've been going on weekends. I'm going to keep it. But what are you doing with it?" She leaned forward slightly. "Mom and Dad put so much into both of us. Into the family. And now Dad's talking about retirement, and his investment accounts took a hit this year. And I just think..." "You just think what?" "I think," she said carefully, "that Grandma would have wanted to take care of the whole family, not just one person." I set down my coffee, slowly. The way you set something down when your hands want to shake and you won't let them. Grandma chose to leave it to me. In her will. That was her decision. Danielle's expression shifted. Something brief crossed her face. Not guilt. Not quite. Something harder. "Mom has plans, Nora. For Saturday. I think you should go." "What kind of plans?" She stood up, smoothed her jacket. "Just go. It'll be better if you don't make it into a thing beforehand." She was already moving toward the door. "Wear something nice. There will be a lot of people there." The door clicked shut behind her. I stood in the middle of my apartment for a long moment. "Mom has plans." The word sat in my chest like a stone. Plans. Not a celebration. Not a gathering. A plan. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, turning it over. The cottage was more than property to me. It was the studio in the backyard where I'd spent entire summers as a kid. It was the creek path I'd walked with my grandmother every morning she let me visit. It was the smell of linseed oil and old wood, and the particular kind of quiet that only exists far enough outside the city. It was, in some real and irreplaceable sense, the place where I had first understood what I wanted my life to be. Grandma had told me in one of our last phone calls that she'd made sure the house was protected. "I left you more than a place to sleep, sweetheart," she'd said. Her voice had been thin by then, tired. "I left you a place to be yourself. Don't let anyone take that from you." I told her not to talk like that. She'd laughed. She'd died 11 days later. Peacefully, in the early morning, the hospice nurse said, like she'd simply decided she was done. I pulled out the box she'd left me the week after the funeral. A worn wooden keepsake box with a small brass latch. Inside, a handwritten letter I'd been too raw to read, a photograph I didn't recognize, and a small brass key with a red ribbon tied through it. I still didn't know what the key opened. I hadn't been able to read the letter either. Every time I started, I got 3 lines in and had to put it down. I left both the letter and the box on my nightstand. The dinner was 4 days away. 2 nights before Saturday, a text came in from a number I didn't recognize. Just 1 line. "Be careful, Saturday. It's not what they're calling it." I texted back immediately. "Who is this?" The 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. Then appeared again, and then nothing. When I tried calling, the line rang twice and went silent. Not voicemail. Just nothing. I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hand and my heart going at twice its normal speed. I looked at Grandma's box on the nightstand. I looked at the letter I still hadn't opened. I picked it up. Her handwriting was looped and careful, the way handwriting gets when someone knows the words matter and takes their time. My dearest Nora, if you're reading this at a family gathering, and knowing your mother, you are, then things have gone exactly the way I was afraid they would. I had to stop. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes for a moment. Then I kept reading. Your mother has been after this house for the last 3 years. She tried twice to convince me to sign it over to the family. I refused both times. After the second time, she stopped visiting. I think you knew that, even if you never asked me why. I had known. I hadn't asked. She will use guilt. She will use the family name. She will put people in a room and make you feel like the problem is you. It has never been you, sweetheart. Not for a single day of your life. I left you something else. Someone, really. Her name is Margaret. She was my closest friend for 30 years, and she knows everything. She has proof of what your mother tried to do to me. If she's not already in that room, she will find you afterward. Trust her. I also left you this. Below that, she'd written out a paragraph in careful capitals. Legal language. I read it twice. Then I read it again. I sat there for a long time in the quiet. On Saturday, I put on a dark green dress I'd bought the year before and never worn. I drove to the Grand Valley Hotel with the letter folded in my purse and my grandmother's voice in the back of my head, steady as anything. The banquet coordinator smiled when I gave my family name and led me down a carpeted hallway past a row of closed doors. She stopped at the last one and pushed it open. 45 faces looked up at me. I knew maybe half of them. My parents' siblings, a cluster of cousins I'd grown up around, my grandmother's church friends seated near the back, people I associated with potluck dishes and Christmas card lists. They were all dressed up, all seated around a long rectangular table with centerpieces I didn't recognize, and none of them said anything when I walked in. They just looked. No streamers, no happy anything, no cake. My parents were seated at the far end, my mother in a cream blazer, her posture perfect. My father in a jacket and tie he wore to funerals. My sister sat next to them, very deliberately not looking at me. At the far end of the room, slightly apart from the main table, sat a woman I didn't know, gray-haired, small, in a simple navy dress. She was the only person in the room who didn't look at me with anything I could identify as judgment. She looked at me like she was relieved I'd shown up. I walked to the empty seat at the opposite end of the table. My heels on the marble floor were very loud. My father stood before I'd fully sat down. Thank you all for coming. His voice carried like he was addressing a board meeting. He has that quality, the ability to make any room feel like a professional occasion. We've brought the family together tonight to discuss a matter of serious concern. He looked at me. Regarding Nora and the future of our family's estate. A murmur moved through the room. As many of you know, he continued, my mother-in-law, Ruth Calloway, passed away in the spring. She was a beloved member of this family, and her loss has been felt by all of us. He paused, performing grief he hadn't shown once since the funeral. She left her primary property, the cottage on Birchwood Road, to Nora alone. A decision that, while we respect her wishes in spirit, we believe does not reflect the needs of the entire family. He looked at the room. Not at me. We've asked you all here tonight as family, as witnesses, because we believe this should be settled as a family. My mother stood. She had a piece of paper in her hand that she set on the table and slid toward me without crossing the distance between us, like she'd practiced the gesture. It's a straightforward document, she said. Her voice was the voice she used at country club dinners. Controlled, pleasant. Designed to make disagreements seem unreasonable. A transfer of property agreement. Nora signs, the estate asset becomes a shared family trust, and everyone is taken care of fairly. She met my eyes, the way your grandmother would have wanted. I looked at the document. I looked at the name typed at the signature line. My name. There was a man in a gray blazer near the side wall. He had a notary stamp sitting on the table next to him. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't have to. My mother tilted her head slightly. We thought it was important to have the family present, for support. Support. 45 witnesses assembled in their Sunday clothes, and she was calling it support. Something cold settled in my chest. Then something else underneath it. Harder. More awake. You know how there's a moment, sometimes, when everything that's been slowly building just arrives all at once? When you finally see the full shape of something you'd been looking at one piece at a time? This was that moment. The dinner invitation. Danielle's visit, the warning text, the notary in the corner, all of it clicked together like tumblers in a lock. This wasn't a family dinner. This was a closing argument. My mother pushed a pen across the table toward me. I looked at it. Then I looked at the woman in the navy dress in the corner of the room. She was watching me the way Grandma used to watch me when I was figuring something out. Quiet. Patient. Letting me get there on my own. And I thought, I left you someone, really. Her name is Margaret. I picked up the pen. If you've ever sat in a room while the people who were supposed to love you most made it very clear that they saw you as a problem to be managed, type "I understand" in the comments, because I need to know I'm not alone in this. And if you want to know what I said next, stay with me. It's worth it. I promise. I turned the pen over in my hand once. My mother's smile widened by a fraction. She thought she had me. She'd spent my entire life having me. I set the pen down. No, I said. The word landed in the silence like something physical. Excuse me? My mother's smile stayed, but her eyes changed. I'm not signing. I pushed the document back toward the center of the table. Not aggressively. Just clearly. But I would like to say something. Nora. My father's voice carried a warning in it that I recognized from childhood. The voice that meant you're embarrassing us in public, and there will be consequences. You assembled 45 people to witness this, I said, looking at him. So let them witness it properly. I reached into my purse and took out my grandmother's letter. My mother went very still. Before she died, I said, addressing the room. Not my parents. The room. My grandmother left me a letter. I was too scared to read it until 2 nights ago. I unfolded it. My hands were steady. I was genuinely surprised by that. I think you all deserve to hear it. Nora, this is not the time, my mother started. You planned every detail of this evening, I said quietly. The venue, the seating, the witnesses, the notary over there with his stamp. You had your time to speak. This is mine. A ripple went through the room. My cousin across the table, a woman named Becca who I'd grown up with and hadn't seen in 2 years, leaned forward slightly. I read the letter. All of it. My grandmother's voice in my mouth, filling the room. The part about my mother trying to take the house twice while Ruth was still alive. The part about the visits that stopped when Ruth refused. The part that said it has never been you, sweetheart, not for a single day of your life. Halfway through, I heard someone at the far end of the table make a sound that wasn't quite a word. When I finished, I looked up. My mother Senwia pressed hair. Her jaw was tight. Your grandmother was elderly and confused in her last year. She wrote things that... She was sharp until the day she died, and you know it. The voice came from the corner. The woman in the navy dress stood up. She walked toward the table the way someone walks when they've been waiting a long time to do it. No hurry. No performance. Just forward motion. My name is Margaret Tran, she said to the room. Ruth Calloway was my closest friend for 31 years. She asked me to be here tonight. She looked at my mother, and something passed between them. Recognition, and something else. Old history. The kind that has weight. Hello, Carol. My mother said nothing. Ruth told me what happened, Margaret said. Both times you asked her to sign the house over. Both times she said no, and you found a reason to stop calling. She set her handbag on the table. She also told me what she suspected you'd do once she was gone. She asked me to make sure you couldn't do it quietly. You have no standing here, my father said. You're not family. Ruth thought of me as family, Margaret said simply. She also thought very carefully about documentation. She reached into her bag and took out a small envelope, the kind you get from a pharmacy when you pick up developed photos. Old-fashioned, small. 3 months before she died, Ruth gave me this. Said to open it if you ever called a meeting like this one. She looked at my mother. She knew you, Carol. She knew you better than you wanted her to. My mother's hand moved to the edge of the table, gripping it. Whatever you think you have, it's not what I think, Margaret said. It's what Ruth wrote. She opened the envelope and spread several pages out on the table. Dated, notarized, witnessed by her attorney. A full account of both conversations where you pressured her to sign over the cottage, including the part where you told her she was too old to make sound financial decisions, and that if she didn't agree voluntarily, you'd pursue a competency hearing. The room broke. Not loudly. Not all at once. In the way rooms break when something true enters them. In small, splintering pieces. A sharp intake of breath near the window. Someone at the end of the table pushing their chair back. My grandmother's church friend, a woman named Dottie who had known Ruth for 20 years, pressing her hand flat to her chest like she needed to hold something in. A competency hearing. My cousin Becca said it out loud, quietly, like she needed to hear the words in the air to believe them. She was never going to pursue it, my mother said quickly. It was a conversation. It was written down, Margaret said, by Ruth, the week after you left. In her own words, with her attorney present. My father had gone the color of old paper. My sister was staring at the tablecloth. This is a private family matter, my mother said, and her voice had shifted. It had lost the country club gloss. Underneath it was something rawer, something that I recognized from rare childhood moments when she'd been caught. The particular quality of a person recalibrating in real time. Whatever grudges old friends carry, it's not a grudge. Margaret looked at her steadily. It's a record. Ruth kept a record because she loved Nora and she knew Nora would need it. She turned to look at me, and her voice softened. She talked about you all the time, you know. Every Sunday after you called, she'd tell me what you were working on. My throat closed. She'd tell me what you were working on. She was so proud of you, Margaret said, every single week. I don't know how long the silence lasted after that. It felt long. It probably wasn't. My father cleared his throat. He looked at my mother in a way that I had never seen him look at her before. Not with deference, not with the practiced solidarity of 30 years of marriage, but with something that looked, for the first time, like accounting. Like a man adding up a column and not liking the total. He didn't say anything. He just looked away. Uncle Pat, my father's older brother, was the first one to speak. He'd been quiet since I walked in, the way he was always quiet at family things, watchful and reserved. Carol, he said slowly. A competency hearing. Against your own mother. Pat, it was never going to. Did you or did you not say that to her? The silence that followed was its own answer. My mother turned toward the room, drawing herself up, pivoting to the last thing she had left, the performance of righteousness. I was trying to protect this family, the way I've always tried to protect this family. If that means making difficult decisions. Pressuring an elderly woman to give up her home, Dottie said from the far end of the table. Her voice was quiet and very sure. Ruth never told us. But she kept it from us to protect everyone else. She shook her head slowly. That was always Ruth. Chairs were moving now. Quietly. Steadily. People gathering bags and coats. My mother spun toward them. We aren't finished. We're not. I think we are, Uncle Pat said. I stood. The room's attention shifted toward me. I want to say one more thing, I said, not loudly. The room was already quiet. The cottage belongs to me. It was left to me legally and with intention, and there is no document I will ever sign that changes that. I looked at the notary by the wall. He was already putting his stamp away. And my grandmother built that protection in on purpose. Her attorney made sure that any agreement signed under coercion is void, and that any family member who contests the will through intimidation forfeits their own claim to the estate. I let that settle. My mother's face had gone very still. So, by all means, I said, take this to court. See what you have left when you're done. I looked at my sister. She was still staring at the tablecloth. I thought about all the years I believed she was just caught in the middle, the way I'd covered for her as kids, the way she'd stood in my kitchen with 2 coffees, performing concern. I hope you know it wasn't worth it, I told her. Not with anger. With something more tired than that. Then I picked up my grandmother's letter, put it back in my purse, and walked toward the door. I was almost out when 3 people stepped into the hallway after me. Becca, her younger brother, Jake, and a girl I barely knew, my cousin's daughter named Lily, who was maybe 20 and had been sitting near the back looking horrified for most of the last hour. Wait, Becca said. I waited. She shook her head. I didn't know about the competency thing. I had no idea any of that was. Neither did I, Jake said. We came here thinking it was genuinely a family dinner. He looked back through the doors. That was not a family dinner. Lily said, very quietly, my mom always told me your side of the family were the difficult ones. She paused. I don't think I'm going to keep taking her word for things. I stood in the hallway of the Grand Valley Hotel in my dark green dress with my grandmother's letter in my purse, and these 3 people looking at me like they were asking permission to choose something different. There's a diner 3 blocks from here, I said. They have pie. Becca almost laughed. Let's go. We walked out into the evening air together, 4 of us. A new math. 6 weeks later, I'm sitting in the studio behind Grandma's cottage. At the work table she built herself out of reclaimed barnwood 20 years ago. The light in here in the late afternoon is the color of honey. I've been working on a series of illustrations that feel, for the first time in years, completely mine. No client brief, no deadline, just the work itself. The fallout came the way these things do, in waves. Becca called me 2 weeks after the dinner with updates. The notary had told someone, who told someone else, and the story of what my mother had attempted, in a hotel ballroom in front of 45 witnesses, on documented record, had made its way through the extended family with the efficiency of all family gossip, instantly and completely. 3 of my grandmother's church friends had stopped speaking to my mother. Not dramatically, just quietly. The way people withdraw from things they no longer want to be near. My father had apparently taken 2 weeks of leave from work to, as he'd told someone, reassess priorities. I didn't know exactly what that meant. I didn't reach out to ask. My sister called on a Wednesday morning. I answered because I always answer. Some habits take longer than others to unlearn. You got what you wanted, she said. I kept what was mine, I said. That's different. The clinic I was going to open, I needed that capital, Nora. I know. And you just, Danielle? I kept my voice even. You stood in my kitchen and told me Mom had plans. You knew what was going to happen that night, and you handed me a coffee and said wear something nice. I waited. That was your choice. What happened after was mine. She hung up. I held my phone for a long moment, looking out the window of the cottage at the old maple tree in the front yard. Then I set it down and went back to work. Margaret comes for tea on Sundays. We sit in the garden when the weather holds, or at the kitchen table when it doesn't, and she tells me stories about my grandmother that I've never heard. The summer Ruth decided to drive across the country alone at 61. The time she submitted a painting to a juried show under a false name, just to see if it would get in without the judges knowing who she was. It did. She was funnier than people knew, Margaret says. She kept that part for herself, mostly. And for you. I'm learning to keep things for myself, too. The work I don't show anyone yet because it isn't ready. The mornings on the creek path that I don't photograph and post. The feeling of sitting in the studio in the late afternoon light and knowing, with more certainty than I've felt about almost anything, that I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Last week, Becca brought her daughter out for the afternoon. The kid is 7 and immediately wanted to know what everything in the studio was for. I handed her a small brush, and we sat side by side at the table, and she painted an extremely interpretive picture of a horse while I worked on my series, and we didn't talk much, and it was one of the nicest afternoons I've had in recent memory. My grandmother would have loved it. My mother hasn't called, I don't expect her to. But I've thought about what I'd say if she did. Not out of hope, but because I think it matters to have decided. I would tell her that I'm not interested in performing forgiveness for an audience. That real repair, if she ever wanted it, would have to be slow and honest and without an agenda. That my door is not locked. But I'm not leaving it open out of guilt or fear, or the old hunger that made me twist myself into smaller shapes for years trying to earn something that was never going to come. I keep the door open because I refuse to become her. That's the line. The one it took me 27 years and one very well-planned ambush in a hotel ballroom to find. There's a photograph on the work table now. The one from Grandma's box, 2 women in their 40s, laughing at something outside the frame. I finally figured out who the second woman was. It's Margaret. 30 years ago, arms around my grandmother, both of them squinting into the sun. My grandmother knew what she was doing. She knew who I'd need, and she made sure they'd be there. I leave you more than a house, sweetheart. I leave you the truth. So that's what happened. My family assembled 45 people in a hotel ballroom to pressure me into giving up everything my grandmother left me. They brought a notary and a legal document, and 30 years of practiced guilt. They thought public shame would do what private pressure hadn't. They were wrong. If you're watching this and something in it sounds familiar, the hunger for approval that never quite arrives, the way you shrink yourself down trying to fit into a shape they find acceptable, I want you to know that I understand. I spent a very long time in that place. And I can tell you from the other side that the shrinking was never the answer. The answer was the thing I was most afraid of, taking up the space I actually needed, without asking permission. You don't have to perform your life for people who treat your presence like a transaction. You are allowed to want things for yourself. You are allowed to keep what is yours. You are allowed to walk out of any room that requires you to disappear in order to stay in it. My grandmother built me a studio and left me a letter and arranged for someone to be in the corner of the room when it mattered most. She did all of that because she believed I was worth protecting. I'm starting to believe it too. If this story meant something to you, type "worth it" in the comments. That's what she used to say at the end of every Sunday call. I'd tell her about the week and she'd say, "Sounds like it was worth it, sweetheart." And somehow it always made the hard parts feel smaller. If you want to hear more stories like this one, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. You can find more in the description below. And take care of yourself. You deserve the kind of people who don't make you earn it. What happened to my family that night wasn't an accident. It was the result of years of choices, stacked one on top of the other, each one made freely and each one carrying a consequence that eventually had nowhere left to go but forward. My mother spent years treating the people around her as pieces to be moved. She pressured an elderly woman, her own mother, twice. She built a plan out of guilt and audience and legal paper, and she believed, right up until the moment it fell apart, that the same tactics that had worked on everyone else would work on me too. What she didn't account for was that my grandmother had spent years preparing for exactly this, not out of revenge, out of love. Ruth understood something that my mother never did, that the way you treat people when you think no one is watching is the exact thing that will define what happens when everyone is watching. The record my grandmother kept, the letter she wrote, the friend she trusted to carry the truth into that room, none of it was a trap. It was simply honesty, preserved carefully, waiting for the moment it was needed. That's the thing about integrity. It doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates, quietly, the same way damage accumulates when it's absent. My grandmother built a life of it. My mother dismantled her own standing, one quiet compromise at a time, until the night it all became visible to 45 people at once. I think about the version of me who almost didn't read that letter, who went to that dinner still half hoping it might be what they said it was, and left the wooden box on the nightstand unopened. That version of me would have sat in that room without the one thing she needed, the knowledge that she was not alone, had never been alone, and that the person who loved her most had made sure of it. The difference between walking out of that hotel with my grandmother's cottage and my own voice, and walking out having signed away both, came down entirely to whether I was willing to face what I already suspected was true. That's what courage actually is, I think. Not the absence of fear. It's reading the letter when you're afraid of what it says. It's standing up in a room full of people who are betting on your silence, and deciding that your silence is no longer something they get to have. The people who showed up in that hallway afterward, my cousin, her brother, a young woman I barely knew who had spent her whole life being told the wrong story. They made their own choice. Nobody asked them to follow me out. They just did it. Because they had the clarity to recognize what they'd witnessed and the integrity to refuse to look away from it. That clarity is a muscle. You build it by using it, and you lose it by letting other people tell you what you saw. I kept the cottage. I kept my grandmother's letter. I kept my work and my studio and the particular kind of quiet that only exists in that backyard in the late afternoon. None of it was handed to me. All of it was chosen, defended, and earned. First by a woman who spent 30 years building something worth protecting, and then by me, when I finally decided I was worth protecting too. That's the story I want to leave you with. Not the drama of one night in a hotel ballroom, but the longer, quieter story underneath it. That what we build with honesty and patience tends to hold, and that what we build on pressure and fear tends to collapse the moment someone refuses to be afraid. My grandmother knew that. I'm learning it. And if any part of this reached you tonight, I think maybe you already know it too.